think before I go anywhere into our agenda for the next while here, I want to go around the room and have you introduce yourselves. Because not everybody in the room is in the same cohort. We kind of, we started realizing this as really the first time we started to do this class and do the classroom research, is that cohorts start to blur after a while. Some people are on a 3-year plan, or 3.5, or 4, 4.5, 5, etc. So we are not all in the same group anymore. So I'll make sure everybody knows who everybody else is. So tell us your name, cohort number, and your major. Let's start there, so at least everybody else knows who else is in the room. So Kevin, you want to start?
I'm Kevin Kanapke, I'm cohort 4, and I'm AYA math.
I'm Kaylee Irvin, and
It's good to have you here. Thank you. Thank you. And I think everybody knows Wendy. I think. So.
they better know. Maybe just a little. Why
All right, good, good.
Oh, what's your name?
This is our kind of our agenda for the next little while here. We're gonna go through a series of about 5 classes together, and our session today will end, I think, with us running over to the spaghetti dinner. For those of you that are eating, you're invited. You're all invited. We're on the 11th floor of Offenhauer, right?
Yep.
Cohort 4 is cooking up the food, so that starts at 6 o'clock, and hope you can join us. So between now and then, while we've done that, we're going to talk a little bit about just this whole idea of action research in the classroom. We're going to talk a little bit more about the syllabus, which we did in the spring, but kind of revisit some things, give you a chance for question and answer. I'll talk a little bit about when our class sessions are going to come up, what we're going to be doing, and kind of create a to-do list for our next time around. So, let me start this way. I had a student in, this has been back about 10 years ago, actually, that the first time that I really worked heavily with a student who was doing some really meaningful action research. I had students doing different other kinds of projects like this before, but this was one that was just really striking to me. The student in my class, her name was Kim. She was an AYA math major, and she asked me to be her advisor for her honors project. Now nowadays, the honors project and the AYA, or the action research project, are one and the same. So you get kind of, if you're an honors program, you get kind of double credit for that, so you're not doing them separately. And actually, we never have had to do them separately, because this was before action ever came along. Anyway, she was studying AYA math, and she was doing an honors project where she wanted to do some research on the students in her own classroom. And what she was most interested in was assessment of what her students were picking up from her. And really, that's what this idea of action research, we have to be careful when we use that term, because when we use the word action research, it has nothing to do with the name of our program. Okay? Because people on the outside here, they say action research. You mean research that action students do? Well, yeah, but it's an action research project. Everybody uses that name, whether you're in action or not. It's a term. So Kim was interested in doing action research. When you think about that type of research, usually it's done in the classroom as a way to analyze your own teaching. Either a strategy you're using, whether students are understanding the stuff that you're hoping they'll understand or whatever, but it's something you're doing with your own class, to gather information. And Kim's big thing was she was really interested in assessment. So she wanted to know whether one assessment method, strategy in her classroom versus another might be better. So she ran a little experiment on her own class to try to figure that out. And what she did is she decided to teach a discrete math unit. And it was a kind of a minor, it was like a 5, it was more than 5, but less than 10, maybe a 7, 8 day unit, something like that, where she was doing something from discrete math. I think she was doing something on social choice, maybe like voting theory or something like that. But she created this series of lessons that she was going to do with her students. And she kind of pre-tested them ahead of time to figure out what they knew about the topic. And she proceeded to teach them over the course of, say, 7 or 8 days. All right, so what happened is, during that time, she, not every day, but most days, after she was finished teaching, she would give her students a journal prompt and ask them to write about something she talked about that day. So she would finish a lesson maybe on using a particular voting method, and she'd throw out a problem or a question or something, have them do some writing in their journal. And then she would read their journal entries and score them on a rubric and give everybody in the class a grade. Okay? And she did that throughout the unit. So imagine that over the course of like 7 or 8 days, she maybe had them write 5 journal entries. and she gave them a score on some rubric scale. I think she was grading it on a 4-point scale. So you get a score from 0 to 4 on each of your 5 writings that you did. And then she recorded a score, a total score from the rubrics for every student. Then, at the end of the unit, she gave them all a test. And a traditional 100-point test or whatever. And she graded the test, and everybody got a score. Well, then what she did is she ran a correlation. Okay? So a correlation means how well does the score that you got on your journal predict the score that you got on the test. In other words, how well are those associated together. You guys have studied correlation, right? Okay? So when I think of correlation, I'm always thinking about one thing predicting something else. How can I use the number of hours you studied for a test to predict the score that you got on the test? Or how can I use some number to predict some other number? So she was interested in knowing how well she could predict their test score based on the journal results that they did. And bottom line is, once she looked at that correlation, she was able to draw some conclusions. And an interesting thing about it, what she found, and you're just dying to find out what the research showed, right? I mean, you're all just you can't wait. So what she found was that it didn't matter whether she used journals or a test. In other words, the journal entry sum was such a strong predictor of the test scores that one of her conclusions was it really wasn't even necessary for me to give them a test. Because by the time we got to the end of the unit, I already knew who was getting it and who wasn't, and what degree they were getting it to. You see what I mean? So in other words, a person who scored maybe 18 or 19 out of the 20 rubric points on the journal probably got an A on the test. And she knew that. And it was very unlikely that a person would accumulate 20 rubric points and get a C on the test or something. It just didn't happen. So her conclusion was, we need to look really carefully at how often we're giving tests and what we're using those for, because in the end, the test tells you this, but it doesn't tell you everything. And I learned a lot more, as much from the journals as I did from the tests. And maybe it wasn't even necessary to burn the test day. So you think about throughout the course of a year, what if you give 5 tests a quarter in your classes? 5 times 4 is 20 days, so you burn 20 days of teaching, giving tests during the school year. Is that a good use of 20 days of your time? And what Kim would say was, no. I could have found out what they learned without ever giving the test, and I could have saved a couple of weeks worth of instruction throughout the year. So, but another conclusion she reached in there also was that she learned some things about the students from the journals that you can't learn from the tests, and vice versa. And so she thought that the two working together were really strong, and so it was a good thing to use multiple forms of assessment to figure out what her students knew, that in the end, it wasn't really necessary to give a test. Okay, so that was Kim's research project, something that she did in her own class to analyze her own teaching and figure out what she wanted to do with that. She was able to write it up in kind of a formal paper. We never actually published Kim's paper. If I had that to do over again, I think we should have published it, because it would have made a good article in a journal. And I've co-published a number of articles over the years with my students, with advisees. In fact, I worked with one the year after that, was doing some things on international education, and she collected some data here, and we wrote a pretty good article together and got it published. So the potential is there to be able to publish some of these things and get them into journals. But at any rate, she learned a lot about how her class operated through doing that project. And her project that she did was a classic example of action research. So in the books that we use for this class in 4160, the author of our book defines it this way, that action research is studying a real school or classroom problem to understand and improve the quality of what you're doing in the classroom. Okay? So it's looking at, this is what I do, or this is what I'm thinking about doing, what kind of impact is it having on my students, and it helps me to think about whether I want to do that again, do it differently next time, do it the same, whatever. So it's analyzing your own teaching practice. Okay? So when you hear the term action research, think of it that way. It is research that is done in your own classroom for the purpose of figuring out what action you want to take based on the data that you get. Okay? And we always take some kind of action on it. We collect the data, we do the analysis, and we say it just didn't matter that I did this versus this. Or, I tried using this lab approach to teaching, and I discovered my students didn't learn any better than they would have if I had just done this, so next time I'm not even sure I'm going to do it. So what actions am I going to take based on the data that I gathered in my classes? Does that make sense? Okay, so somebody just throw out an example off the top of your head. What might be something that you could do action research on in your own classroom? Anything you can think of. You could say, I could do a study of this. Jake?
Maria mentioned it to me earlier today, but like specific manipulative use in the high school classroom, like to teach a math lesson.
Okay, good. So maybe I'm going to be teaching a math lesson in an algebra class and I want to use algebra tiles. And I'm wondering, how do my students react to it? And how deeply do they understand? I could do that in middle school class too, right? How effectively are my students going to make sense of this algebra situation by using algebra tiles? And so maybe I'm going to do this lesson or this series of lessons with them, do some kind of an assessment and see what impact that had on their visualization and their thinking. And that would maybe help me to decide not only whether I want to use algebra tiles next time, but how I might use them better or more effectively. Okay, good one. Give me another example. What about a science context?
I talked to Dr. Haney about doing, if you were outside versus inside, and like teaching the same lesson, if student participation changes based on the environment.
Yeah, how about the physical environment of your classroom? What's that going to look like if you're teaching a lesson outside versus in? How do they react? Do they pay better attention? Are there things you can do outside that you can't do inside, vice versa? And studying those two things, kind of a comparison. Give me one more example.
Maybe for another science, we're doing like labs before lessons or lessons before labs.
Okay, good, good. Does it make more sense to do the lesson before the lab or the lab before the lesson? You know, the age-old question, right? And Becca knows that, right? I mean, so this whole thing about where's the best place to place the lab experiment or experience really in the sequence of learning. And I'll try it a couple of different ways and see how students react and then write about that. Sometimes an action research project borders on a full-scale experiment. Okay, so an experiment might be something like this, where I say, all right, I'm going to go into a high school and I'm going to take 2 chemistry classes, and in one chemistry class we're going to do the lab the first day to open the unit, and I'm going to do some instruction behind it. And then my other class, I'm going to do the instruction first and we'll do the lab at the end. And then at the very end, or throughout, I'm going to collect some data. I'm going to interview students, maybe videotape them, give them a test, all these kinds of things. And I'm going to analyze then which one of those strategies work best with the students. And then I'm interested in publishing this in a journal, saying I ran an experiment. And what I found in my class was when you do it this way, it was better than when you do it that way. And you kind of explain it and try to generalize it for people. Okay? That's kind of a big, full-blown experimental type of project. That's really not what action research is usually about. Usually the action research is on a much smaller scale. It's one class, my own students, and I'm thinking I'm going to try this lab first instead of last and see how it plays out. And I'm going to collect data about that, write about it, and try to make some decisions about whether I want to do that again next time. So we're not necessarily running an experiment. Okay? So a lot of times people think of, when you think of research, you think of running an experiment, right? Do it this way and see how they compare. You don't really have to do that with action research. In fact, most people don't. And if you do choose to do it that way, and you want to do it as a research study, it's not only more full-blown in terms of the way that you do the research, but you also have to get permission to make that happen. You actually have to go to somebody on campus called the Human Subjects Review Board, and that group of people has to look at this research you're going to do and decide whether or not it's okay for you to do that. They've got to give you approval. And the students themselves have to sign off to be part of that research, and so do their parents. It's a whole other level of stuff that has to happen. You'll actually hear from the Human Subjects Office in January. They'll come and do a little bit on that in case you're thinking about moving in that direction, at least you know what it is. So here's an example for the students that I teach in my 8th grade class. They are part of an ongoing research study that I've been doing for years on how 8th graders make sense of the math content that I teach. And so at the beginning, so throughout the year, anything we do in the class, I can videotape them, I can audio tape, I can use their journal entries, I can use their homework assignments, their tests, things they wrote on the board I can take a picture of and I can use in a presentation, and so forth. But only if the students give me permission to do that. So at the beginning of every school year, I have to send a form home that they sign and another form home that their parents sign, and I have to keep those on file at the university to prove that the students said it's okay to use their work in my research. Because if I write an article or I write a book or I give a presentation and I pop up on the screen some 8th grader's work and that student didn't give me permission, there's a legal issue there. Okay? Theoretically, they could come right after me and say, I never gave you permission to use my work. So we have to be careful about getting the proper permission. If it's within your own class, like Kim's was, all I'm doing is just teaching my own group of kids, and I'm just wondering what happens when, that's no big deal. It doesn't require permission from them or anybody else, and it doesn't matter. Okay? But the research matters because we learn a lot from it.